Now, it's chapter 17 of Theologico-Political Treatise by Baruch Spinoza. Now, in this chapter, it covers something that I've never really thought about, especially like in detail, about the Hebrew Republic, the First Republic. And he calls it a republic, which is interesting. Because all along we've been talking about a commonwealth, or he's been calling it a commonwealth. Then in this chapter, he calls it a republic, and in fact he goes on to describe it, and what comes out is that indeed it was a republic, the first Jewish commonwealth. That's the commonwealth that Moses created and left behind. And then he tells us that this republic survived for quite a while, and then at some point it collapsed. And in the next chapter, indeed, he doesn't mention the reasons why, or he enumerates the reasons why that republic collapsed, and then how the entire Commonwealth ended up collapsing as well. Of course, there were external forces like I think it's the Babylonian who came and they conquered them, either the Babylonian or the Persians. I might be wrong on that. But of course, the two had conquered the Jewish Commonwealth at one point or another. Now, in this chapter, he describes the Jewish state, the first Jewish state, how its political organization, how it was organized. And but there's something he does in the very beginning of the chapter that leaves me kind of perplexed. He talks about something that leaves you speculating on what exactly he was trying to say. And to me, it seems like he wanted to say something about Moses and his motivation. Maybe motivation is not the exact word, but the nature of the state he built, and in fact the sources or where the narrative of God being the founder of the state of Israel came from. Because it turns out this was not a peculiar thing to the Israelites, like having God as the ultimate sovereign, or the source of authority for a sovereign. Those are two different things. God can be the ultimate sovereign of a state, as it was the case with the Jewish Commonwealth, but it can also be the source of authority for the people who hold the sovereign authority. And when God being at that apex point of the structure of a state was not peculiar to the Israelites. And in fact, currently I'm reading a book by a guy known as Cassius. Is a history of Rome, and the same themes kind of play out, like gods. In the case of Rome, it was gods, not God, being like the ultimate source of the sovereign authority. Now, let's come to what he says in the beginning of this chapter that leaves me kind of perplexed, and it gives room for speculation. It seems like there are things that Baruch believed about the origins of the Jewish state, but at the time he was writing this book, he wasn't really ready to come out clear and say it, but he just kind of described it. So it's upon you to kind of come to that conclusion, or if that doesn't happen, then it's still okay. You can still go on and get whatever else he says about that, the origin of that state. Now, here is what he talks about. He says, throughout history, kings in particular have spread the idea that they were descended from the immortal gods. Thinking that if their subjects and the rest of mankind did not look at, or expecting that by so saying or making the subjects believe that they, the kings, were offsprings of gods, then the subjects will not look at them as equals, and in fact they will respect them more, and then make it easy for them to rule. Because here is something, and he does talk about this a little bit, which is an idea I've also learned from a different book, a more current book by Robert Greene about the 48 laws of, I think it's the 48 laws of power, or the law of human nature, where he talks about envy, and it says we always envy our equals, especially when our equals tend to move above us a bit, then we are very envious of them. But if they were not our equals from the beginning and they are above us, we are not envious of them. I think this is what was happening here. These people understood human nature very well, and they knew that if the subjects saw the kings as equals, as humans like them, then there was always going to be a problem of envy, and there will always be this problem of them trying to bring them down, because they are like, you're just a human like me, I can as well bring you down and take that position. But if the subjects see these kings as descendants of gods, then no, we're different, so I cannot envy them. So that's what he talks about. The beginning of the chapter, in fact, he gives examples where situations where kings tried to make themselves seem like they were descendants of of gods, and by so doing, kind of like implying they were sacred and divine. He talks of Augustus of Rome. Augustus told Romans that he was the descendant of Aeneas, who was the son of Venus. These are gods. Alexander also used to say that he was the son of Jupiter. Used to tell people around him that he was a descendant of Jupiter, a god. So by so doing, they were doing whatever I've already described. Now, after talking about that, now he moves into the state, the first Commonwealth of the Jewish Commonwealth, and now he talks about Moses and God, and he tells us that at the formation of this state, like any other state, the individuals had to surrender some of their rights to the sovereign. Now, that's what happens in every state, even currently, when you are a citizen of a country, you've surrendered some of your right to the sovereign, who can be a king, can be a president, can be anybody who is the ultimate leader of a country and makes some of the critical decisions on behalf of everybody else. It says that's what happened. Now, in most states, so those rights we transfer go to another human being, a king, whatever. But in this case, the state of Israel, the first Commonwealth, was so unique compared to others that were around it, because for them, they did not choose a person to surrender some of their natural rights to. They chose a God, and now they surrendered their rights to that God. Now, it so happened that this God could not interact with them like a human would, and for a state to function, of course, the person wielding the sovereign power has to interact with the citizens. So what happened is that the Bible says the Israelites, all of them went to see God, but they could not withstand the face of God, or something like that. I think it's in the Bible. So what they did, they came back and told Moses, you know what, we can't face God. So we leave you to be seeing God on our behalf. And then in that instant, Moses became like a go-between God, the sovereign authority of the state, and the state itself, the people, the Commonwealth. Now, they say, now, as part of, while other empires and kingdoms had palaces where the king resided, the Israelites had a tabernacle, which was like a symbolic living place of the state sovereign authority, God. And the Levites were the courtiers. In other empires, we have courtiers, people who function or work within the palace and make things work. In the state of Israel, the first Commonwealth, it was the Levites who became now the courtiers, the people who were serving the king, God, and making things happen in the royal dwelling place. Moses was a unique leader of this new Commonwealth that was created. And in fact, there was none that became like Moses after him. And I know that's a line that is said a lot, but we are talking in terms of political organization, in that it's only Moses in that first Commonwealth who was both a judge, and also he was also like the ruler, kind of like acting on behalf of God. But so before Moses passed on, he made sure that he split his office. And this is something I'm going to talk more about as we move on, about the separation of powers, which I found to be so interesting, the way Baruch describes it. Now, another unique thing, so something we always take for granted, and I think I've mentioned this a few times when we read the Bible, is this assumption we have of, we are reading it, looking at it as a religious organization, which is not what it was. It was not a religious organization. It was a state. But we always have this wrong, me personally, I had this wrong I've had this wrong view when I read the Old Testament. For me, I'm reading about religion. But turns out it wasn't religion, it was a political organization, it was a state. I'm reading a constitution and laws and ordinances and whatever. So Baruch says the dogmas of religious were not precepts, but laws and ordinances. Piety was regarded the same as loyalty, and impiety as the same as disaffection. So this was a state. It wasn't really a religion. And it tells us that everyone who fell away from religion ceased being a citizen, and was that on that ground alone counted an enemy. So if you stopped practicing whatever that Moses had set down, then you ceased being a citizen of that Commonwealth. Then you'll be viewed as an enemy, in fact. And those who died fighting for the sake of that religion, they were considered to have died for a country. Like today we have soldiers who go fight on their behalf of their country. So it wasn't really a religion. And in fact, Baruch tells us, which is something I found to be something that, I don't think it's Baruch says, but the person who translated this book makes a note of saying that in the biblical Hebrew, there was no word for religion. There was no word for religion. He says the word that is currently used to like talk of religion is a root of knowledge. So because this was a state for them, they didn't see it as religion and state. It was just a state with laws and way people live, and it was a commonwealth. So it's us who now read the Bible, who ascribe those practices and everything to be religion. That's not what it was for them. For them, it was a commonwealth, a state, and like we have now constitutions and penal code in the countries we live in. That's what it was for them. So it's us who now. Now, when Moses left or died, the Israelites had already given their authority to him, not really to him, but to God, to decide for them almost everything. So when Moses was about to go, he made very critical decisions, which of course he said is God who made them, such as I've said, splitting his office into 2 offices. And there is one of the oracle, the person who talks to God, the high priest, and then there is the person who is like the chief, or you can call them like maybe a prime minister in today's understanding, who was like Joshua, and he was at the same time the commander-in-chief, if you might call them using today's words. Before then, Moses had all these powers. He spoke to God, he commanded the army, he was the chief justice, in fact. But in this case, that office had been separated into 2 now, so that the person speaking to God, the oracle, the high priest, his work was simply to talk to God, and they will be consulted to tell the person who is the chief commander what God says should be done. And the chief command happens also to be the chief justice, if you might call them, like he was the ultimate judge. And he says that now the way this was arranged before Moses was dead was God, Moses as a high priest, and also like the chief chief justice, and then there was and he was also the general-in-chief of the army. That's Moses. But when it was gone, then Joshua became the general-in-chief of the army and chief judge, and now he was helped by a council of captains. This is another something that Baruch spent some time explaining, that there were 12 tribes of the Israelites, and each of these tribes was also led by someone, a captain. And in fact, the reason why he ends up calling it a republic is because each of these 12 tribes were kind of like semi-autonomous. They had a captain who was the leader of that. The captain was in charge of the army of that certain tribe. The captain of that tribe could go to the high priest and make consultation about their own tribe. And so they were critical. They had their own judges within each tribe. So they had some functions that they used to do within their own tribe. So this state was very devolved. And that's why I think Baruch ends up calling it a republic. Even though there's another place where he calls it it's a republic, but the theocratic republic. Yeah, that's what it is. Of course, I've said there were judges. Besides the chief judge, there were other judges, in fact, in each of these tribes, 12 tribes. There was also the separation of power, which I've mentioned that before. When Moses left, he made sure he split his office so that there is the high priest who functions as the go between God and the people. And then there is this person who is holding the executive powers, and he also the general-in-chief of the army, who was Joshua after Moses left. So the separation of power worked that the way Baruch describes it, he says, the high priest indeed had the right to interpreting the laws. Besides talking to God, the high priest could interpret the laws and communicating the answers of God. That's what the high priest did. But he could not do so when he liked, as Moses could, but only when he was asked by the general-in-chief of the army, the council, or similar authority. So the high priest just sat there. They did not do anything. They could not just come and tell these people what to do. He waited until they came to him to find out what God would want them to do. On the other hand, the chief general-in-chief and the council could consult God when they liked, but could not receive his answers could only receive his answers through the high priest, so that the utterances of God, as reported by the high priest, were not decreased as they were when reported by Moses, but only answers. They were accepted by Joshua and the council, and only then had the force of command and decree. So before they would go to the high priest, maybe they want to go to war and try to find out, is God okay with us going to this war? And the high priest will, of course, say if he's consulted God, and he'll give them answers. Now, the high priest will not come and give them answers before they ask for them. And these answers will not become decrees until the general-in-chief and the council had accepted them. Then they became decrees. Now, what was so different from this political organization from the rest that were there at the time? it is this separation of powers. For most empires that existed then, the king did everything. He was the one to come up with the laws, to decide. For most people, even though when you read other books, you realize, for example, the Greek city-states had similar things like this, where there was an oracle that they would go and consult on critical matters. But there were others that were the king, like if you go to the Persians, the king kind of decided everything, even though he had also the people will consult, but often he was like the final, like whatever he decided that was, it was. But for the Greeks are now looking at the organization of the Israelite first Commonwealth, those powers were separated. So rights and power administration according to the laws. So I've talked about that. I've also talked about Israel, the first Commonwealth, being a devolved state. And then what else? Yeah, so there's another thing he touches on is why the Israelites were very patriotic. And he says that they were very patriotic, one, because they held God to be the ultimate sovereign. Unlike some other empires and kingdoms, for them God was there, and they consider themselves to be children of God. And they had this sense of brotherhood that emanated from the divine law, caring for your neighbor, which was so powerful in the society. They also, their army, the way their army was formed was kind of different from other, because when you read other books, for example, you read histories by Herodotus, you look at the Persians and you look at some of the Greek city-states, there was a lot of hiring soldiers from other places to come and fight. The kings will even sometimes ignore their own people and go hire people from outside to come and fight on their behalf, and sometimes fight to control their own people. But this was banned in the state of Israel, the first Commonwealth. In fact, there was no king anyways. The leaders could not go and hire people from outside. They depended on soldiers that came from the 12 tribes, and that increased the patriotism that these people had for their Commonwealth. Yeah, so that's chapter 17 about the organization of the first Commonwealth, of the first Jewish Commonwealth. It was a republic. He describes it as a republic. It was devolved with 12 units, each with some autonomous powers. There was separation of power, of course, with the person interpreting the law being different from the person implementing it and such things.